How does one defend a castle? When discussing castles, we usually consider them in isolation from one another, often as formidable installations in their own right, as something meant to defeat an attacker on their own. While this would be desirable, the reality is that if a castle were to be besieged, there's little chance it could hope to hold out on its own. A reinforcing army would be required. So too, if castles were treated in isolation, they could reasonably be bypassed. But in practice, they often were not. Castles were constructed with both of these considerations in mind, such that the defensive and offensive capabilities of the frontier were maximised, with each castle forming only one node of a wider network. In some cases, this even extended to legal and administrative privileges for the owners. While we tend to gravitate towards major battles as anchors for historical study, these are generally an anomaly, or a sign that the defences have already been partly cracked. If the network does do its job, they're not necessary. This strategy, and by extension our clearer understanding of it, comes from an earlier period, from the late Roman era. After the crisis of the 3rd century and the reforms of Diocletian, the Roman army was split into the Limitani, border troops, and the Comitatensis central army. In the event of a breach in the border fortifications, the Comitatensis would reinforce the Limitani in the imperiled area, then withdraw once the threat has been managed. This broad approach was maintained, but with developments over time in the ability for the forts themselves to anchor positions. In the event that either a raid or invasion beyond the frontier were necessary, the forts provide a perfect jumping-off point and logistical hub, as well as a refuge should something go wrong and they are required to retreat. In this context, for England and Wales especially, castle networks fall into two broad categories: those meant to defend a frontier or possible avenue of invasion, and those meant to secure an unstable hold on a region, such as Cardiff Castle. In both cases, the same rules apply. They must be placed in areas which are tactically advantageous to give the best chance of successful defence, and strategically able to control communication lines, mutually support, and both raise and host relief armies, which will break sieges elsewhere. Without these, castles can be bypassed or broken. The case of garrisoning is more easily understood, as raising castles to billet troops in hostile territory is a clear statement of power, and even should these castles be threatened, they will hold out easily against an enemy unprepared for a siege. These types of castles are present throughout England, though not in as great a concentration as the frontier castles. In Wales, they are concentrated in the south, taken as it was so quickly, but not properly subdued for quite some time afterwards. The castles in Northern Ireland are also predominantly of this type, with more being found in the modern Republic of Ireland in the south. Clan castles, such as Dunscaith Castle in the Scottish Highlands, feature similarly, but with the addition of typically acting as a seat for the clan in question, and as a kind of more isolated frontier fortification for inter-clan warfare. Ironically perhaps, these are the better representation of what a castle is thought to be and do, despite only forming a portion of the castles of the British Isles. In the English context, the main castle networks for frontier defence are the southern coast, Welsh marches, and Scottish marches. These are places where defending against invasion were the main motivation, though in other areas this was also true on a shorter time frame, for example the ring of castles built under Edward I to contain the northern Welsh princes. Although some of these will have been lost to time, mostly wooden Motte and Bailey castles which were never upgraded and were left to degrade, we have enough remaining to clearly see the clusters of castles to defend various strongpoints which might have become jumping-off points for a deeper invasion. On the southern coast, much was invested to ensure that William's vector of attack could not be repeated. On the Scottish border, the relative ease of movement down the eastern coast is reflected in a relatively massive density of castles, while the western side is relatively sparsely populated on both sides of the border, relying on more isolated strongpoints. In both of these cases, many of the earliest castles are updates and adaptations of Roman forts. On the Welsh border, the centre and south of the border are relatively well defended, but the north less so, representative of disadvantageous terrain and thus castles which could not be properly defended, subsequently being destroyed, and a lack of interest in building them due to some combination of the poverty of Cheshire while the border was hostile, and the impracticality of using them as offensive jumping-off points. This is unlike the south, which was secured relatively early, but still required castles to launch incursions during times of unrest. In any case, The exception is revealing because the poverty of the northern Welsh marches was perpetuated by its lack of defences, and remained one of the poorest regions of England until after the end of the Welsh Wars. Another instructive example is that of the Crusader states prior to the Battle of Hattin. More or less the whole country was protected by a world-leading series of castles, deliberately built in a short period of time to enable the Crusaders to survive in the hostile environs with minimal need for costly battles. They could not afford to take a large amount of losses due to their scarce manpower, so they honed these tactics to near perfection. The castles, particularly Carrack guarding the southeastern flank but supported by other castles in the vicinity like Montreal, especially given arid conditions, were formidable obstacles in their own right, but worked in tandem with the field armies, which could be given ample time to muster. Once the field army was able to be committed, the attrited Muslim army would be vulnerable to a multi-pronged attack from both the field army, the garrison of the besieged castle, and potentially side garrisons from other nearby castles. This process usually resulted in the Muslim armies retreating rather than fighting the disadvantageous battle, thus achieving victory for the Crusaders without significant bloodshed. Only with the Battle of Hattin was this strategy made untenable, and not for its failure, but for the deviation from it, when the field army ventured too far from the support of the castles to fight a pitched battle against an unencumbered foe, only to be defeated and destroyed. Even so, many of the castles held out for years, but without hope of relief, their situation was hopeless. The main exception to this model simply further reinforces its general accuracy. English adulterine castles were those constructed without the approval of the royal court, which was otherwise required. Few of these survive today, as they were mainly a product of the anarchy in the 12th century, when royal authority collapsed, and Henry II, who followed, made it a deliberate policy to tear them down as a reassertion of his authority. However, it is not clear how many were truly destroyed this way, largely because so many were only constructed as temporary expedients, and often in proximity to an existing castle, where the prior existing castle typically was more attractive to maintain. These are better thought of, therefore, as a more permanent form of circumvallation, or contravallation, that is, the fortifications built by a besieging force to protect their own troops from either a sortie by the garrison or relief by an outside force. Most famously perhaps constructed by Caesar's army during the Siege of Alesia. Once the sieges were over, and the conflict settled, they had served their purpose and were abandoned. In truth, this model was never really outmoded. This consideration has mainly revolved around medieval cases, but even many of the castle networks described functioned in much the same way during the English Civil War, fulfilling the same role as staging points for offensives and pinning the enemy in place. During the 80 Years' War in the modern Benelux region, up to the works and writings of Vauban in the 17th and 18th century, the trend abates slightly in design, if only because the individual fortifications have become so massive that the distance between them can be greater without concern that they will fall before relief arrives. And indeed, some of the benefits of multiple nearby castles are combined into one fortress, with outlying bastions able to occupy vital ground, with support from the main fort. Perhaps the greatest triumph of fortress network design is, however, synonymous with its failure. The Maginot Line, while not intended as the sole object of French strategy, was impressive enough for its ability to shift troops between fortresses without need of exposing them to any danger, housing barely fathomable quantities of provisions to hold out functionally indefinitely, while the manoeuvring armies either supported them or made use of the openings they may provide. Much like the Crusaders, it fell victim to the isolation and destruction of the field army, rendering it unimportant to the outcome of the war. Similarly, like the Crusaders, the fortifications outlived the integrity of the state they defended. It does imply, however, that this strategy has not been fundamentally outmoded. Besieging measures have vastly improved since the days of the Motte and Bailey, but so have the fortifications themselves. If properly employed, they may offer the same reliable benefits they always have. In summary, although our general perception of castles are as individual installations meant to defeat an invasion outright, this was rarely, if ever, the case. Instead, castles were mutually supporting and reliant on relieving armies, which the castles themselves screened. The implications of this, on appreciation of the castles themselves, is not always immediately obvious, but can come across in where they're placed, in what density, and sometimes how they're built, to facilitate their relief from an invader, or the slipping away of a garrison or VIP. Ludlow Castle is a confluence of all these factors. Sitting on a communications juncture between South Wales and southern England, supported by and supporting other nearby castles south of the Shropshire Hills as a natural defensive barrier, able to act primarily as a rallying point for a reinforcing army coming from Wales, or, as it happened, to facilitate the escape of the future King Edward IV.